The evening air carried the scent of jasmine and distant rain as Nicholas Baker stood at the edge of the park, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for freedom. The streetlights cast golden pools on the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance, the city hummed its eternal lullaby of traffic and late-night conversations. He could feel Daniel Howard's presence beside him, warm and solid and impossibly close. Close enough that their shoulders brushed with each breath, close enough that Nicholas could smell the faint cologne that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. Quote zero. Daniel had said 20 minutes ago, standing in the doorway of Nicholas's apartment with that crooked smile that made something twist painfully in Nicholas's chest. Darm. Now they were here, suspended in this moment that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, and Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to change. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but charged with something electric, something that made Nicholas's skin feel too tight and his thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. Daniel turned to look at him, and in the amber glow of the streetlight, his eyes held a question that Nicholas wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for someone to speak first, to acknowledge the thing that had been building between them for months, like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you are watching from and hype this video and in the comments. But to understand how they arrived at this moment, suspended between friendship and something infinitely more dangerous, we need to go back to where it all began. 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday that started like any other Tuesday, but ended with Nicholas's carefully constructed world tilting on its axis. Nicholas had been living in the city for 2 years, sharing a cramped but cozy apartment with his roommate Sarah Jackson, a perpetually cheerful art student who had a habit of leaving paintbrushes in the kitchen sink and bringing home strays both human and feline. It was Sarah who had mentioned that her friend Daniel would be crashing on their couch for a few weeks while he looked for a place of his own. "He's going through a rough patch," Sarah had explained, stirring pasta sauce with one hand while scratching behind the ears of their latest feline acquisition with the other. His girlfriend just moved out, took half his stuff and left him with a lease he can't afford alone. Nicholas had nodded absently, only half listening as he graded papers at the kitchen table. He taught high school English at a small private school across town, and his evenings were usually consumed with red ink and the endless struggle to convince 16-year-olds that Shakespeare was actually relevant to their lives. The prospect of a temporary roommate barely registered as more than background noise. That changed the moment Daniel walked through their door. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that looked like he'd been running his fingers through it, which Nicholas would later learn was exactly what he did when he was nervous or thinking hard about something. His eyes were the color of coffee with too much cream, warm and expressive, and currently shadowed with the kind of exhaustion that came from having your life turned upside down. He carried a duffel bag and a guitar case, and when he smiled at Nicholas, something in Nicholas's chest did a slow, dangerous flip. "You must be Nicholas," Daniel said, extending a hand that was calloused from guitar strings and warm from the October air. "Sarah's told me a lot about you. Thanks for letting me crash here." Nicholas shook his hand, trying to ignore the way Daniel's fingers lingered just a moment longer than necessary, trying to ignore the way his own pulse jumped at the contact. Quote 6. He managed, his voice steadier than he felt. Quote 7. Daniel laughed, a sound that was rich and genuine and made Nicholas want to say something clever, just to hear it again. Quote pad. And just like that, Daniel Howard became part of their daily routine. He was surprisingly neat for someone who'd been living with musicians, keeping his belongings confined to a tidy corner of the living room and always washing his dishes immediately after using them. He worked construction during the day and played guitar at a small coffee shop downtown 3 nights a week, coming home with stories about difficult customers and the eccentric regulars who treated the place like their personal living room. Nicholas found himself looking forward to these stories, to the way Daniel's face animated when he talked about the elderly woman who came in every Thursday and requested the same Joni Mitchell song, or the college student who always left poetry written on napkins. There was something magnetic about Daniel's enthusiasm, the way he found genuine interest in the small details of other people's lives. The first month passed in a blur of comfortable domesticity. Daniel proved to be an excellent cook, often taking over dinner duties and filling their small apartment with the scents of garlic and herbs and whatever spices he'd discovered at the farmer's market that weekend. He had a gift for making even the most mundane ingredients taste like something special. And Nicholas began to understand why Sarah had been so eager to have him stay. But it was the quiet moments that undid Nicholas completely. The evenings when Daniel would sit on the couch with his guitar, fingers moving over the strings with unconscious grace while he worked out new arrangements. The mornings when Nicholas would stumble into the kitchen to find Daniel already awake, making coffee and humming under his breath. The way Daniel would look up from whatever he was doing and smile, as if Nicholas's presence was the best part of his day. Nicholas told himself it was just friendship. Daniel was straight, after all, recently out of a long-term relationship with a woman, clearly still processing the end of that chapter of his life. Nicholas had been down this road before, had learned the hard way that falling for straight men was a recipe for heartbreak. He'd built careful walls around his heart, had learned to appreciate male beauty from a safe distance without letting it mean anything more. But Daniel made those walls feel as substantial as tissue paper. It started with small things. The way Daniel would brush against him when they were both reaching for something in the kitchen. The contact lasting just a beat longer than necessary. The way Daniel's eyes would linger on Nicholas's face when he thought Nicholas wasn't looking. The way conversations between them seemed to carry an undercurrent of something Nicholas couldn't quite name but felt in every nerve ending. Nicholas tried to convince himself he was imagining it. Daniel was just naturally warm, naturally tactile. Some people were like that, generous with casual touch and eye contact. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. The first crack in Nicholas's denial came on a Friday night in November. Sarah had gone home to visit her parents for the weekend, leaving Nicholas and Daniel alone in the apartment for the first time since Daniel had moved in. Nicholas had been grading papers at the kitchen table while Daniel practiced guitar in the living room, the soft melody providing a pleasant backdrop to his work. Around 10 o'clock, Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway, guitar still in hand. He announced. Nicholas looked up from the essay he'd been reading about symbolism in The Great Gatsby, noting the way the kitchen light caught the gold flecks in Daniel's eyes. Quote 11. Daniel moved around the kitchen with easy familiarity, gathering ingredients and humming the melody he had been playing. Nicholas tried to return to his grading, but found himself distracted by the domestic scene unfolding in front of him. There was something deeply appealing about watching Daniel cook, about the careful attention he paid to heating the milk just right and the way he tasted the mixture with a small spoon, adjusting the sweetness until it met his standards. Here, Daniel said, sliding a mug across the table. Their fingers brushed as Nicholas reached for it, and Nicholas felt that familiar jolt of electricity that seemed to accompany every casual touch between them. Thanks, Nicholas managed, wrapping his hands around the warm ceramic. The hot chocolate was perfect, rich and sweet with just a hint of cinnamon. This is incredible. Daniel settled into the chair across from him, cradling his own mug. My grandmother's recipe. She insisted that store-bought hot chocolate was an abomination against nature. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, the only sounds the gentle clink of mugs against the wooden table and the distant hum of traffic outside. Nicholas found himself studying Daniel's profile, the strong line of his jaw and the way his dark hair fell across his forehead. In the soft kitchen light, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable than the confident musician who entertained crowds at the coffee shop. Quote 16, Daniel said suddenly, his voice quiet. Nicholas felt his pulse quicken. Quote tone, Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring down into his mug as if the swirling chocolate held the answers to life's mysteries. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, measured. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? The question caught Nicholas off guard. He set down his mug, giving Daniel his full attention. What do you mean? I don't know. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, that nervous gesture Nicholas had come to recognize. It's just, ever since Jessica left, I've been thinking about things, about the life we had planned together, the person I was when I was with her. And I keep wondering if any of it was really me, or if I was just playing the role I thought I was supposed to play. Nicholas felt something twist in his chest, a mixture of sympathy and something deeper, more dangerous. That's a pretty heavy question for a Friday night. Daniel looked up, meeting Nicholas's eyes directly. Chuptrod. The words hung in the air between them, charged with meaning that Nicholas wasn't sure either of them was ready to acknowledge. He could feel his carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, could feel himself leaning into the conversation in a way that felt both natural and terrifying. I think, Nicholas said carefully, that sometimes it takes losing something to realize whether it was really ours to begin with. Daniel nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Nicholas's face. Quote 26. The moment stretched between them, intimate and fragile, until Daniel finally looked away, breaking the spell. They finished their hot chocolate in companionable silence. But something had shifted between them that night. Some invisible line had been crossed that neither of them could uncross. The weeks that followed were a careful dance of attraction and denial. Daniel began to linger in conversations, asking Nicholas about his day with a genuine interest that felt like more than casual roommate concern. Nicholas found himself sharing stories about his students, about the books he was reading, about his thoughts on everything from music to politics to the way the light fell through their kitchen window in the morning. Daniel proved to be an excellent listener, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights that revealed a depth Nicholas hadn't expected. He learned that Daniel had studied literature in college before dropping out to pursue music full-time, a decision that had caused a rift with his parents that he was still trying to repair. He learned that Daniel wrote his own songs but was too self-conscious to perform them in public, preferring to stick to covers of other people's work. Quote, in 27. Nicholas had suggested one evening as they cleaned up after dinner. Quote, 28. Daniel had looked at him with something that might have been longing. Quote, 29, he'd said quietly, someday. The physical tension between them continued to build in small, almost imperceptible ways. Daniel would find excuses to touch Nicholas's shoulder when he passed behind him in the kitchen. Nicholas would let his hand linger when he passed Daniel a cup of coffee. They began to sit closer together on the couch during their evening conversations. Close enough that Nicholas could feel the heat radiating from Daniel's body. Close enough that he had to resist the urge to reach out and touch. It was torture of the sweetest kind. Nicholas tried to convince himself that he was reading too much into things, that Daniel was just naturally affectionate, and Nicholas was projecting his own desires onto innocent interactions. But late at night, lying in his bed and listening to Daniel moving around in the living room, Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that something was building between them, something that felt inevitable and terrifying in equal measure. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in December. Nicholas had been having a particularly difficult day at school, dealing with a parent conference that had gone badly and a stack of essays that seemed to grow larger rather than smaller, no matter how many he graded. He'd come home exhausted and frustrated, wanting nothing more than to collapse on the couch with a glass of wine and forget that the outside world existed. He found Daniel in the kitchen, stirring something that smelled like heaven on the stove. The sight of him, domestic and comfortable in their shared space, made something in Nicholas's chest clench with want. Daniel asked, glancing over his shoulder with a sympathetic smile. Quote 32. Nicholas confirmed, dropping his bag by the door and rubbing his temples where a headache was beginning to form. Quote 33. Quote 30, Daniel said, turning to face him fully. Quote John, Nicholas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Quote Tannen, Daniel laughed. Quote, Nicholas settled onto the couch, letting his eyes drift closed as the sounds and smells of Daniel's cooking filled the apartment. There was something deeply soothing about being cared for like this, about having someone who noticed when he was having a bad day and took steps to make it better without being asked. When Daniel appeared with 2 steaming bowls, Nicholas felt something dangerously close to love bloom in his chest. This is incredible, Nicholas said after his first bite, the rich broth and tender chicken working their magic on his frazzled nerves. Seriously, where did you learn to cook like this? Daniel settled beside him on the couch, closer than usual, their thighs almost touching. My grandmother mostly. She insisted that anyone who wanted to eat her food had to learn to make it themselves. I spent most of my childhood summers in her kitchen, learning her recipes and listening to her stories about the old country. She sounds wonderful. She was, Daniel said softly. She died when I was in college. I still miss her every day. Nicholas felt a wave of sympathy wash over him, Without thinking, he reached out and covered Daniel's hand with his own. The contact sent electricity shooting up his arm, but he didn't pull away. "I'm sorry," Nicholas said quietly. "Losing someone who means that much to you, it never really stops hurting, does it?" Daniel looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing almost unconsciously across Nicholas's knuckles. "Code 47, he said. Their eyes met, and Nicholas felt the world narrow to just this moment. This couch, this man whose hand was warm and solid beneath his own. The air between them felt charged, electric, with possibility and danger. Dear 49. Daniel said quietly, his voice rough with something that might have been longing. Quote, Daniel started, then stopped, shaking his head. Quote, 50. But it wasn't nothing, and they both knew it. The moment hung between them, fragile and precious, until Daniel finally pulled his hand away and the spell was broken. They finished their dinner in relative silence, the easy conversation from earlier replaced by something heavier, more loaded with unspoken words. Nicholas tried to focus on the food, on the comfort it provided, but his mind kept returning to the way Daniel had looked at him, the way his voice had sounded when he'd said Nicholas's name. That night, Nicholas lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what was happening between them. Daniel was straight. Daniel had just gotten out of a long-term relationship with a woman. Daniel was his roommate, his friend, someone he couldn't afford to lose by misreading signals and making assumptions. But the way Daniel had touched his hand, the way he'd looked at him, the careful way he'd started to say something before stopping himself, it all felt like more than friendship. It felt like the beginning of something Nicholas had been afraid to hope for. The next few weeks passed in a haze of carefully controlled tension. Daniel seemed to be making an effort to maintain some distance, their conversations becoming more surface level, their casual touches becoming less frequent. Nicholas told himself this was for the best, that whatever had been building between them was dangerous territory that was better left unexplored. But late at night, when the apartment was quiet and Nicholas could hear Daniel moving around in the living room, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were both holding their breath, waiting for something to break. The break came on a Friday night in mid-December. Sarah had gone out with friends, leaving Nicholas and Daniel alone in the apartment once again. Nicholas had been reading on the couch when Daniel emerged from the kitchen with 2 glasses of wine and a look of determination on his face. "We need to talk," Daniel said, settling beside Nicholas on the couch and handing him one of the glasses. Nicholas felt his heart rate spike. "About what?" Daniel took a long sip of his wine, as if gathering courage. "About this thing that's been happening between us. About the way we've been dancing around each other for weeks, like we're afraid to say what we're both thinking." Nicholas felt his mouth go dry. "Daniel, I don't think—" "I'm attracted to you, Bavlam," Daniel said quietly, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. "I know that's probably not what you want to hear, and I know it complicates everything, but I can't keep pretending it's not true." Nicholas stared at him, wine glass frozen halfway to his lips. "You're attracted to me?" Daniel nodded, his eyes never leaving Nicholas's face. Quote 60. Nicholas set down his wine glass with trembling hands. "Tish to quote, I don't know," Daniel said firmly. Quote amount. Nicholas felt his world tilt on its axis. Everything he'd been trying to deny, everything he'd been afraid to hope for, was suddenly laid out between them like a map to territory he'd never dared to explore. "I've been thinking about that too," Nicholas admitted quietly. "About you, about us. But I was so sure you were straight, so sure I was imagining things." Daniel reached for Nicholas's hand, intertwining their fingers with a gentleness that made Nicholas's heart race. "I don't know what I am," Daniel said honestly. "I don't know if there's a label for what I'm feeling or if I need one. All I know is that when I'm with you, everything feels right in a way it never did with Jessica, in a way it's never felt with anyone." Nicholas looked down at their joined hands, at the way Daniel's thumb was tracing patterns across his knuckles. Quote 68, he said softly. Quote 69, Daniel replied. Quote 70, Nicholas looked up, meeting Daniel's eyes directly. In them he saw uncertainty and hope and desire, a mirror of everything he was feeling himself. "I think I might be more than okay with it." Daniel smiled, the first genuine smile Nicholas had seen from him in weeks. "So what do we do now?" I don't know, Nicholas admitted. I've never been in this situation before. You're the first straight guy I've ever had feelings for who actually had feelings back. Former straight to guy, Daniel corrected with a small laugh. I think my membership to that club might have been revoked. Nicholas felt something warm and bright bloom in his chest. So we figure it out together? Together, Daniel agreed, lifting their joined hands to press a soft kiss to Nicholas's knuckles. The gesture was so tender, so full of promise that Nicholas felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. They sat like that for a long time, hands intertwined, talking quietly about what this meant and where they wanted to go from here. Daniel admitted that he'd been questioning his sexuality for months, even before his relationship with Jessica ended. Nicholas confessed that he'd been attracted to Daniel from the moment they met, but had been too afraid of ruining their friendship to act on it. Quote 79. Daniel said as the evening wound down. Quote 80. Nicholas nodded, understanding the wisdom in taking things slow, even as every cell in his body was screaming for him to close the distance between them and finally taste Daniel's lips. We have time, he said, all the time in the world. But as they said goodnight and went to their respective sleeping spaces, Nicholas couldn't shake the feeling that time was exactly what they didn't have, that this fragile new thing between them needed to be nurtured carefully before the outside world had a chance to interfere. The next morning brought an awkwardness that neither of them had anticipated. Nicholas woke to find Daniel already in the kitchen, making coffee with the kind of focused intensity that suggested he was using the task to avoid thinking about other things. They exchanged polite good mornings, but the easy intimacy of the night before seemed to have evaporated with the sunrise. Nicholas found himself second-guessing everything. Had Daniel meant what he said? Or had the wine and the late hour made him more honest than he'd intended to be? Was he having regrets in the harsh light of day? These fears were put to rest when Sarah returned from her weekend away. Nicholas was grading papers at the kitchen table when she burst through the door, arms full of shopping bags and stories about her weekend adventures. Daniel emerged from the living room to greet her, and Nicholas watched as his eyes immediately sought out Nicholas across the room, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. The smile was private, intimate, meant only for Nicholas. It said everything that words couldn't in front of Sarah, and Nicholas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. Over the next few days, they fell into a new rhythm. Their conversations were still careful, still dancing around the edges of what they'd admitted to each other. But there was an undercurrent of anticipation that made even the most mundane interactions feel charged with possibility. Daniel began to find small ways to touch Nicholas throughout the day, a hand on his shoulder as he passed behind him in the kitchen, fingers brushing as they reached for the same book, the kind of casual contact that could be explained away as friendly if Sarah happened to notice. But that felt like promises to Nicholas. Nicholas found himself hyper-aware of Daniel's presence in their shared space. The sound of his guitar drifting from the living room became a soundtrack that made Nicholas's heart race. The sight of Daniel cooking dinner, humming under his breath as he moved around the kitchen, became a domestic fantasy that Nicholas allowed himself to indulge in. They began to stay up later, finding excuses to linger in the living room after Sarah had gone to bed. These conversations were different from the ones they'd had before Daniel's confession, weighted with new meaning and possibility. They talked about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. Daniel shared stories about growing up in a conservative family that had never quite understood his artistic ambitions. Nicholas talked about coming out in college, about the friends he'd lost and the family members who'd struggled to accept him. Daniel asked one night as they sat on opposite ends of the couch, a careful distance between them that felt both necessary and torturous. Quote 84, Nicholas admitted. Quote 85. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Quote 86, he said finally, but quote 87. Nicholas felt his heart clench with sympathy and something deeper. Quote 88. Quote I, as Daniel said quietly. Quote 90. These conversations became the highlight of Nicholas's days. The way Daniel looked at him when they talked, with such focused attention and genuine interest, made Nicholas feel seen in a way he'd never experienced before. It was as if Daniel was memorizing him, cataloging every expression and gesture like they were precious things worth preserving. The first time Daniel played one of his original songs for Nicholas, it was on a Tuesday night in early January. Sarah had gone to bed early, claiming she had an exam the next morning, leaving Nicholas and Daniel alone in the living room with the soft glow of the table lamps and the distant sound of rain against the windows. Daniel had been particularly quiet that evening, picking at his guitar strings with an absent-minded focus that suggested his thoughts were elsewhere. Finally, he looked up at Nicholas with an expression that was equal parts nervous and determined. Daniel said. Nicholas felt his pulse quicken. Quote 92, quote 93, quote. Daniel said, adjusting his grip on the guitar. Quote 94. Nicholas nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Daniel's fingers found the strings, and the melody that emerged was soft and haunting, with an underlying complexity that spoke to the skill Nicholas had only glimpsed in Daniel's cover performances. When Daniel began to sing, his voice was rough with emotion, the lyrics painting a picture of someone discovering parts of themselves they'd never known existed. The song was about transformation, about the courage it took to step into unknown territory, about finding home in unexpected places. It was beautiful and raw and so clearly about them that Nicholas felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. When the last note faded into silence, Daniel looked up at Nicholas with an expression that was vulnerable and hopeful and terrified all at once. It's beautiful, Nicholas said softly. Daniel, that was incredible. Daniel's smile was bright enough to power the entire apartment. What a shout at a quote because Nicholas replied, meaning every word. Quote 9. Daniel set his guitar aside and moved closer on the couch, close enough that Nicholas could see the gold flecks in his eyes, close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from Daniel's body. I've been thinking, Daniel said quietly, about what you said about taking things slow, about giving us the best chance to work out. Nicholas felt his heart rate spike. Yeah, I think I've been overthinking it, Daniel continued. I think maybe the best way to figure out what this is between us is to stop being so afraid of it. Nicholas felt the air between them shift, becoming charged with the kind of electricity that precedes a storm. What are you saying? Daniel reached out, his fingers brushing against Nicholas's cheek with a tenderness that made Nicholas's breath catch. I'm saying that I want to kiss you. I've wanted to kiss you for weeks, and I'm tired of pretending otherwise. Nicholas felt his world narrow to this moment, this couch, this man whose eyes were dark with want and whose touch was setting every nerve ending in Nicholas's body on fire. Quote 107, he whispered. Quote 108. Daniel asked, his thumb tracing the line of Nicholas's jaw. Can I kiss you? Instead of answering with words, Nicholas closed the distance between them, his lips meeting Daniel's in a kiss that was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as they both realized that this was really happening, that the thing they'd been dancing around for months was finally becoming real. Daniel tasted like the wine they'd shared earlier, and something uniquely him, something that made Nicholas want to memorize every detail of this moment. His lips were soft and warm, and when his tongue traced the seam of Nicholas's mouth, Nicholas opened for him with a soft sound of surrender. The kiss deepened, became more urgent, months of suppressed desire pouring out between them. Daniel's hands tangled in Nicholas's hair, and Nicholas found himself pulling Daniel closer, needing to eliminate every inch of space between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Daniel rested his forehead against Nicholas's and smiled. Daniel said softly, Quote 111. Nicholas agreed, his voice rough with emotion. Quote 112. They stayed like that for a long moment, foreheads touching, breathing the same air, both of them processing the magnitude of what had just happened between them. Daniel said eventually, his voice carrying a note of wonder. Quote 104. Nicholas laughed, feeling giddy with relief and joy in the sheer impossibility of this moment. Quote 115, yeah, quote 116, Daniel admitted, his cheeks flushing slightly. Quote 117, yeah, Nicholas felt something warm and bright bloom in his chest. Quote 100, Daniel pulled back just enough to meet Nicholas's eyes directly. I want you to know that this isn't just physical for me. I mean, the physical part is incredible, obviously, but it's more than that. I think I'm falling in love with you. Nicholas! Nicholas felt his heart stop, then start again at double speed. You think you're falling in love with me? I know I am, Daniel corrected, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. I love the way you listen when people talk. Really listen. like their words matter to you. I love the way you get excited about books and the way you worry about your students even when they drive you crazy. I love the way you make me feel like I'm worth something, like I'm interesting and funny and worth spending time with. I love your laugh and the way you look when you're concentrating on something and the way you make the most ordinary moments feel special just by being in them. Nicholas felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. No one had ever spoken to him like this before, with such genuine appreciation for who he was as a person. Daniel, he said softly. I know it's fast, Daniel continued, and I know this is all new territory for me, but I've never been more sure of anything in my life. I love you, Nicholas. I'm in love with you. Nicholas cupped Daniel's face in his hands, thumbs brushing across his cheekbones. He said, the words feeling like a prayer, like a promise, like the most natural thing in the world. At 1:27, Daniel's smile was radiant. Really? Really? Nicholas confirmed. I tried so hard not to fall for you, tried to convince myself it was just attraction, just friendship, just anything other than love. But you made it impossible not to love you. Daniel kissed him again, soft and sweet and full of promise. When they broke apart, both of them were smiling like teenagers with their first crush. So what happens now? Daniel asked. Nicholas considered this, his mind racing through all the practical considerations, all the ways their lives would need to change to accommodate this new reality. Well, he said slowly, I suppose the first thing is that you're going to need to find a different place to sleep. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Are you kicking me out already? No, Nicholas laughed. I'm inviting you into my bed, if you want. No pressure, but the couch can't be comfortable long term. And if we're doing this, if we're really doing this, then I want to do it right. Daniel's eyes lit up. Quote 137. Nicholas felt his heart swell with happiness. Quote 138. They talked for another hour, making plans and sharing fears and mapping out the tentative shape of their future together. When they finally went to bed, it was together, Daniel's arms wrapped around Nicholas as they settled into the unfamiliar intimacy of shared sleep. Nicholas lay awake for a while after Daniel's breathing had evened out into the rhythm of sleep, marveling at the turn his life had taken. 3 months ago, he'd been content with his quiet existence, his carefully ordered world of work and books, and the occasional casual date that never led anywhere meaningful. Now he was in love with a man who'd turned his world upside down in the best possible way. A man who'd been brave enough to question everything he thought he knew about himself in order to find something real and true and worth fighting for. The next few weeks were a period of adjustment and discovery. They told Sarah about their relationship on a Sunday morning over breakfast, both of them nervous about her reaction. Sarah's response was to throw her arms around both of them and declare that she'd been waiting for them to figure it out for months. You two have been making hard eyes at each other since Daniel moved in, she said, laughing at their surprised expressions. I was starting to think I was going to have to lock you in a closet together to get you to admit your feelings. The relief of having Sarah's support made everything feel more real, more permanent. They began to act like a couple openly in their shared space, holding hands while watching television, sharing quick kisses in the kitchen, falling into the easy intimacy of two people who were genuinely happy together. Daniel proved to be an affectionate partner, always finding small ways to show his love throughout the day. He would leave little notes in Nicholas's lunch bag, bring him coffee in bed on weekend mornings, play soft melodies on his guitar while Nicholas graded papers in the evening. These gestures were small but meaningful, constant reminders that Nicholas was loved and valued and thought about even when they were apart. Nicholas found himself becoming more open, more willing to express his own affection in ways that felt natural and unguarded. He would massage Daniel's shoulders after long days of construction work, surprise him with his favorite takeout when he'd had a particularly difficult gig, listen with genuine interest to his stories about the characters he encountered at the coffee shop. They developed their own routines and inside jokes, their own language of glances and touches that spoke to the deepening intimacy between them. Nicholas had never experienced this kind of partnership before, this sense of being truly known and accepted by another person. The physical aspect of their relationship developed naturally, without pressure or awkwardness. Daniel approached intimacy with the same thoughtful attention he brought to everything else. asking questions and paying attention to Nicholas's responses, making sure they were both comfortable with each new step they took together. Nicholas had been with men before, but never with someone who was exploring his sexuality for the first time. And he found Daniel's wonder and enthusiasm both endearing and incredibly attractive. Daniel approached each new experience with a combination of nervousness and curiosity that reminded Nicholas of his own first relationships, and he felt honored to be the person Daniel trusted to guide him through this exploration. Their first time making love was on a snowy evening in February. Sarah was spending the night at her boyfriend's apartment, leaving them with rare privacy in their shared space. They'd been kissing on the couch, the familiar heat building between them, when Daniel pulled back and looked at Nicholas with eyes that were dark with want and something deeper. "I want you," Daniel said simply. "All of you. I'm ready." Nicholas searched his face, looking for any sign of uncertainty or pressure. "Are you sure? We don't have to rush anything." "I'm sure," Daniel replied, his voice steady and certain. "I've never been more sure of anything." What followed was tender and passionate and perfect in ways that Nicholas hadn't known were possible. Daniel was an attentive lover, focused entirely on Nicholas's pleasure and comfort, asking soft questions and responding to every sound and movement with careful attention. When Nicholas returned the favor, Daniel's responses were so genuine and unguarded that Nicholas felt overwhelmed by the trust Daniel was placing in him. Afterward, they lay tangled together in Nicholas's bed, Daniel's head on Nicholas's chest, both of them quiet and content in the aftermath of their intimacy. "That was," Daniel started, then trailed off, apparently unable to find adequate words. "Yeah," Nicholas agreed, his fingers combing through Daniel's hair. Quote 148, quote 149, Daniel said quietly. Quote 150. Nicholas felt his heart clench with love and tenderness. Quote 151. Cowan and he admitted. Quote 152. Daniel lifted his head to look at Nicholas directly. Quote 153. Quote where Nicholas asked, though he thought he knew the answer from the soft expression on Daniel's face. "Good scared," Daniel confirmed. "The kind of scared that comes with knowing you found something worth protecting, something worth changing your whole life for." Nicholas kissed the top of Daniel's head, breathing in the familiar scent of his shampoo and the lingering traces of his cologne. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Nicholas woke the next morning to find Daniel watching him with a soft smile and eyes full of love. "God want Ed," Daniel said, pressing a gentle kiss to Nicholas's lips. "Good morning," Nicholas replied, stretching languidly in the warm cocoon of their shared bed. "How long have you been awake?" "A while," Daniel admitted. "I like watching you sleep. You look so peaceful, so content. It makes me happy to know that I get to be part of that contentment." Nicholas felt his heart swell with happiness. This was what he'd always wanted but never dared to hope for. This easy intimacy, this sense of being cherished and valued and loved exactly as he was. As winter melted into spring, their relationship continued to deepen and strengthen. Daniel officially moved into Nicholas's bedroom, and they began to talk about finding a larger apartment together, a space that would be truly theirs rather than something they were sharing with a roommate. Daniel's family proved to be more accepting than he'd feared when he finally worked up the courage to tell them about Nicholas. His parents were surprised but ultimately supportive, and his younger sister was delighted to have a brother-in-law who could discuss literature with her when she came to visit. Nicholas's family, who had long since accepted his sexuality, welcomed Daniel with open arms. His mother was particularly charmed by Daniel's cooking skills and his habit of bringing his guitar to family gatherings. And Nicholas's father appreciated Daniel's knowledge of construction and his willingness to help with various home improvement projects. The integration of their families felt natural and right, another sign that what they had together was built to last. Daniel's music began to evolve as well, his songs becoming more personal and honest as he processed his own journey of self-discovery. He started performing some of his original material at the candy shop, and the response from audiences was overwhelmingly positive. Nicholas attended every performance he could, sitting in the back with a proud smile as Daniel shared pieces of his heart with strangers. Quote 163. Nicholas suggested one evening after a particularly well-received performance. Quote 164. Daniel looked at him with surprise and something that might have been hope. Quote 165, the quote 166 Nicholas replied firmly. Quote 167. The encouragement seemed to unlock something in Daniel, and he began to take his music more seriously, spending hours refining his songs and researching local recording studios. Nicholas loved watching him work, loved the focused intensity Daniel brought to his craft, and the way his face lit up when he found the perfect chord progression or lyrical phrase. Their life together settled into a rhythm that felt both exciting and comfortable. They had their routines and their shared interests, but they also maintained their individual identities and friendships. Nicholas continued to pour his energy into teaching, finding new ways to engage his students and help them discover their own love of literature. Daniel balanced his construction work with his music, slowly building a following and working toward the goal of making music his full-time career. They supported each other's dreams and celebrated each other's successes. And when challenges arose, they faced them together with the kind of partnership that Nicholas had always hoped for, but never quite believed he would find. The first real test of their relationship came in late spring when Daniel was offered an opportunity to tour with a more established musician, a month-long series of shows that would take him across the country and potentially open doors for his own career. The opportunity was incredible, exactly the kind of break Daniel had been working toward, but it would mean being apart for longer than they'd ever been separated since they'd gotten together. Daniel said when he told Nicholas about the offer. Quote 169 Sharon, Nicholas felt a surge of love for this man who was willing to sacrifice his dreams for their relationship, but he also knew that he could never let Daniel make that choice. Quote 1, Nicholas said firmly. Quote 171, quote Shannon, Daniel asked, his voice small and uncertain. Quote 173. Nicholas cupped Daniel's face in his hands, looking directly into his eyes. That's not going to happen, he said with absolute certainty. What we have is stronger than that. A month is nothing compared to the lifetime I want to spend with you. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. About 7, Nicholas replied. Quote 1 each. Daniel took the tour, and the month they spent apart was difficult, but ultimately strengthening for their relationship. They talked every day, sharing the details of their separate experiences and counting down the days until they would be reunited. Nicholas threw himself into his work and spent time with friends, rediscovering parts of himself that had been dormant since he'd fallen in love. Daniel sent postcards from every city and called with stories about the audiences and the other musicians and the incredible response his songs were receiving. When Daniel returned, tanned and tired and full of stories, their reunion was everything Nicholas had hoped it would be. They spent the first 3 days barely leaving Nicholas's apartment, reacquainting themselves with each other's bodies and sharing everything they'd experienced while apart. Quote 179. Daniel said as they lay in bed on his third night back, their legs tangled together and their fingers intertwined. Quote 180, unquote, Fun, Nicholas asked, pressing a kiss to Daniel's shoulder. I realize that home isn't a place for me anymore, Daniel said softly. It's you. Wherever you are, that's where I belong. Nicholas felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. You're my home too, he whispered. You've been my home since the night you made me hot chocolate and asked me about living someone else's life. The tour had been a success beyond Daniel's wildest dreams. Several record labels had expressed interest in his music, and he'd been invited to collaborate with established artists on upcoming projects. The opportunities were exciting and potentially life-changing, but Daniel made it clear that any decisions about his career would be made with Nicholas's input and support. Quote 1, Daniel said when they discussed the various offers he'd received, whatever we decide together. Nicholas felt overwhelmed by gratitude for this man who had not only found the courage to redefine his entire understanding of himself, but who continued to choose their relationship over and over again, even when presented with opportunities that could change his life. They spent hours talking through the pros and cons of each opportunity, weighing the potential benefits against the challenges they would face. Some of the offers would require Daniel to relocate to Nashville or Los Angeles, major music centers where he would have access to better resources and networking opportunities. What do you think? Daniel asked after they had reviewed all the options. Quote 49. Nicholas looked at this man he loved, this brave and talented person who had turned his world upside down in the best possible way, and realized that he was ready for whatever adventure came next as long as they faced it together. Nicholas said without hesitation. Quote 191. Daniel's smile was radiant. Really? You'd leave your life here to follow my crazy dreams? They're not just your dreams anymore, Nicholas replied. They're our dreams. And besides, there are schools everywhere. I can teach anywhere. But there's only one you, and I'm not about to let geography separate us now. They chose Nashville, drawn by the city's rich musical heritage and the specific opportunities Daniel had been offered there. The decision felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The kind of leap of faith that would have been impossible for Nicholas to make alone, but felt natural and right when he was making it with Daniel. The process of relocating was chaotic and stressful and wonderful. They found a small house in a neighborhood full of musicians and artists, a place with character and charm, and enough space for Daniel to set up a proper home studio. Nicholas found a position at a private school that specialized in arts education, a perfect fit for his interests and experience. Sarah was sad to see them go, but supportive of their decision, and she helped them pack their belongings with the kind of enthusiasm that only true friends could muster for major life changes. Their families were proud and excited, and their friends threw them a going-away party that lasted until the early hours of the morning. The drive to Nashville felt like the beginning of a new chapter, the landscape changing outside their windows as they traveled toward their future together. Daniel had made a playlist for the trip, songs that told the story of their relationship and their hopes for what lay ahead. 25, Daniel asked as they crossed the state line into Tennessee. 26, Nicholas admitted. 27. Daniel reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity that had developed over months of loving each other. 199. Nicholas agreed, and the word felt like a promise, like a prayer, like the most important truth he'd ever spoken. Their first months in Nashville were a whirlwind of new experiences and challenges. Daniel threw himself into the music scene with the kind of passion and dedication that Nicholas had always admired, building relationships with other musicians and producers and working on the album that would be his major label debut. Nicholas adapted to his new job and new city with the resilience he'd developed over years of navigating change and uncertainty. His students were different from the ones he'd taught before, more focused on creative pursuits and more open to the kind of innovative teaching methods he'd always wanted to try. They made new friends and discovered new favorite restaurants and coffee shops, building a life together in a city that felt alive with possibility and creative energy. Daniel's career began to take off in ways that exceeded even his most optimistic expectations, and Nicholas found fulfillment in supporting the man he loved while also pursuing his own professional growth. The success was wonderful, but it also brought new challenges. Daniel's hiring schedule became increasingly demanding, with recording sessions and promotional appearances that kept him away from home for long stretches. Nicholas struggled sometimes with the loneliness and the pressure of being the partner of someone whose career was becoming increasingly public. They had their first real fight on a humid evening in July, after Daniel had missed dinner plans for the third time in 2 weeks due to a last-minute studio session. Nicholas had spent the evening alone in their new house, grading papers and trying not to feel sorry for himself. But when Daniel came home at midnight with apologies and explanations, Nicholas's frustration finally boiled over. "I know your career is important," Nicholas said, his voice tight with suppressed emotion. "I know this is what we came here for, but I feel like I'm disappearing. Like I'm just the person who keeps the home fires burning while you go out and live your dreams." Daniel's face crumpled with guilt and regret. Two. Quote 20. Nicholas interrupted. Quote to him. The fight that followed was their first real argument, full of hurt feelings and misunderstandings and the kind of harsh words that come from fear and frustration. But it was also necessary, a clearing of the air that allowed them to address the growing imbalance in their relationship. When they finally exhausted their anger and hurt, they sat on opposite ends of their couch, both of them drained and uncertain about how to bridge the distance that had opened between them. Quote 205, Daniel said quietly, his voice hoarse from arguing. Quote 206, quote 207, Nicholas replied, quote 208. They talked through the night, working through their fears and resentments and finding the ways to better balance Daniel's career ambitions with their relationship needs. Daniel committed to better communication about his schedule and to protecting certain times that would be just for them. Nicholas acknowledged his own insecurities and agreed to be more direct about his needs rather than expecting Daniel to intuit them. The conversation was difficult but ultimately strengthening, a reminder that love required ongoing effort and attention, especially when external pressures threatened to pull them in different directions. "I want to marry you," Daniel said as the sun was beginning to rise outside their windows. The words coming out of nowhere but feeling completely natural in the context of their long night of honesty and reconnection. Nicholas felt his heart skip a beat. "What?" "I want to marry you," Daniel repeated, his voice stronger and more certain. "I want to make this official, to show the world that you're the most important person in my life, to make promises to you that I'll keep even when everything else gets crazy." Nicholas stared at him, processing the magnitude of what Daniel was saying. "Are you proposing to me?" "Not yet," Daniel said with a small smile. "When I propose, it's going to be romantic and planned and perfect. This is just me telling you that I want to spend the rest of my life with you, officially and legally and in front of everyone we love." Nicholas felt tears spring to his eyes. "I want that too," he said softly. "I want to be your husband." "Good," Daniel said, pulling Nicholas into his arms, "because I was hoping you'd say yes when I actually ask." The promise of marriage changed something between them, adding a new dimension of permanence and commitment to their relationship. They began to plan for a future that included wedding venues and guest lists and the kind of legal and financial entanglement that came with making a life together official. Daniel's proposal came 3 months later, on a crisp October evening, as they walked through the park where they'd had their first real conversation about the future. He'd arranged for a musician friend to play softly in the distance, while he got down on one knee and offered Nicholas a ring that was simple and perfect and exactly what Nicholas would have chosen for himself. Quote 20, Daniel said, his voice shaking with emotion. Quote 21. Nicholas was crying before Daniel finished speaking, overwhelmed by the love and gratitude and sheer joy of this moment. Quote Tayo, he said, his voice breaking. Quote to Tayo. The kiss they shared after Daniel slipped the ring onto Nicholas's finger tasted like tears and laughter and the promise of forever. Around them, the park was alive with the sounds of evening, but Nicholas felt like they were the only two people in the world. Their wedding was small and intimate, held in the backyard of their Nashville home with their families and closest friends in attendance. Daniel wrote a song for the occasion, performing it as part of his vows, and Nicholas read a poem he'd written about the unexpected ways love could transform a life. The ceremony was perfect in its simplicity, a celebration of the journey they'd taken together and the commitment they were making to continue that journey as husbands. When they were pronounced married and invited to kiss, the applause from their loved ones felt like a blessing, a confirmation that what they'd built together was worth celebrating. The reception was a joyful chaos of music and dancing and toasts that made everyone cry. Daniel's grandmother's recipes featured prominently in the menu, and Sarah gave a speech about how she'd known from the beginning that they were meant for each other, even when they were too stubborn to see it themselves. As the evening wound down and their guests began to drift away, Nicholas and Daniel found themselves alone in their backyard, surrounded by the detritus of celebration and the warm glow of string lights. "So," Daniel said, pulling Nicholas into his arms, "how does it feel to be married?" "Perfect," Nicholas replied without hesitation. "It feels absolutely perfect." They danced slowly to the music drifting from their sound system, both of them tired but reluctant to let the day end. This was what Nicholas had always dreamed of, but never quite believed he would find. This sense of being completely known and loved and chosen by another person. "I love you, husband," Daniel whispered against Nicholas's ear. Quote 2229. Nicholas replied, the word feeling new and wonderful on his tongue, which brings us back to that evening 3 months after their wedding, when Daniel appeared at Nicholas's apartment door, asking for fresh air and a walk, when they found themselves standing in the park under the streetlights with the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Except now, Nicholas understood what had been in Daniel's eyes that night, the question he'd been afraid to ask and the hope he had been afraid to voice. Now he knew that the walk hadn't been about fresh air at all, but about Daniel working up the courage to tell Nicholas how he felt, to take the leap of faith that would change both their lives forever. I was so scared that night, Daniel said now, his arm wrapped around Nicholas's waist as they stood in the same spot where everything had begun. Minus 231, quote Searson, Nicholas admitted, quote Patricion. Daniel laughed, the sound warm and familiar in the cool evening air. Quote Han and quote Tosh, Nicholas said with a grin. Quote Sakon, quote Han, Daniel confessed. Quote Tibonane, Nicholas turned in Daniel's arms, looking up at the man who had become his husband, his partner, his home. And now? Now I get to be this close to you for the rest of our lives, Daniel said, his voice soft with wonder and gratitude. Now I get to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep with you every night and build a life with you that's better than anything I ever dreamed possible. Nicholas stood on his toes and kissed his husband, tasting the promise of forever in the sweetness of Daniel's lips. Around them, the city continued its eternal rhythm, but they were lost in their own world, their own story, their own perfect love. Quote 242, Nicholas said when they finally broke apart. Quote 243, quote Daniel replied, taking Nicholas's hand and intertwining their fingers with the easy familiarity of two people who had chosen each other over and over again, who had built something beautiful and lasting from the courage to be honest about what they wanted. They walked home together through the quiet streets, their footsteps echoing in harmony, their hands linked and their hearts full. Behind them, the park held the memory of that first tentative conversation about fresh air and the courage it took to follow someone you loved into unknown territory. Ahead of them lay the rest of their lives, full of music and laughter, and the kind of love that transforms everything it touches. And in this moment, walking through the city that had become their home, Nicholas felt nothing but gratitude for the night Daniel had said he needed fresh air, and then walked right beside him until they reached his building, the night that had started them on the path to everything they'd built together. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the simplest requests, with someone brave enough to ask for what they need and someone else brave enough to say yes. Sometimes fresh air is just an excuse to spend more time with the person who's already become the center of your world, even when you're too afraid to admit it yet. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that walk leads you home to a love that changes everything, a love worth redefining yourself for. A love that proves that the most frightening leaps of faith often lead to the most beautiful discoveries. Nicholas squeezed Daniel's hand as they climbed the steps to their front door, both of them smiling at the memory of how far they'd come and the promise of how far they still had to go together.